The glass doors of Carter Dynamics' Manhattan flagship restaurant closed with a sound so soft it almost felt polite. But inside, the air was anything but calm because William Carter, billionaire CEO and architect of one of the fastest-growing tech empires in America, had just looked at the young black waitress standing beside his table and said, in a voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet elegance of the room, "You can't even read a simple menu. Are you illiterate?" The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy and deliberate, and for a fraction of a second, the entire restaurant seemed to forget how to breathe. Crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. Conversations dissolved into silence, and even the soft jazz playing in the background felt like it had been turned down by an invisible hand. Aaliyah Johnson didn't react the way people expected her to. She didn't flinch, she didn't argue, she didn't step back. She simply stood there in her pressed black uniform, hands steady on the edge of the leather-bound menu, eyes lowered just long enough to make it seem like she was absorbing the insult rather than resisting it. Around her, the world of wealth continued to exist as if nothing had happened. Lawyers in tailored suits reviewing documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars, investors leaning in over a table that could buy most buildings in the city, and assistants quietly adjusting tablets and briefcases as if humiliation was just another item on the agenda. William Carter leaned back in his chair, the faintest smirk forming at the corner of his mouth, as though he had just confirmed something he already believed about the world, that people like her existed only on the margins, functional but insignificant. "Maybe try reading it slower," he added casually, not even bothering to lower his voice, and a few of the men around him chuckled, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of habit, the kind of laughter that comes from agreeing with power. Aaliyah finally lifted her gaze, not to meet his challenge, but to look past him, toward the glass walls of the restaurant where the reflection of the entire city shimmered in the distance, millions of people moving through their lives, unaware of this single moment, building pressure inside a quiet corner of Manhattan. She had worked at places like this long enough to understand the rules: stay quiet, stay efficient, stay invisible. But something about the way he said it, illiterate, as if it defined her entire existence, settled differently, not as pain, but as recognition of something deeper, something structural. Her fingers tightened slightly around the menu, not in anger, but in calculation, because just 10 minutes earlier, while refilling water glasses at the adjacent table, she had noticed something unusual: a legal document partially exposed on the corner of William Carter's deal briefing, a clause buried deep in technical language that didn't belong in a standard acquisition agreement. At first glance, it meant nothing to most people in the room, but Aaliyah had spent 2 years before this job studying corporate law at night classes, and what she had seen didn't leave her mind. The restaurant, designed to feel like power itself, had a physical address, suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like every expensive detail was compressing inward. William Carter tapped his fingers once against the table, impatient, expecting obedience, expecting her to step away quietly and disappear back into the structure of service that people like him never questioned. Instead, Aaliyah placed the menu gently on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the marble surface. And in that small, controlled motion, there was something the room did not immediately recognize as change. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't resisting loudly. She wasn't breaking anything. She was deciding. And for the first time that evening, William Carter looked at her not as background noise, but as something unresolved. The restaurant did not move, but something inside it shifted in a way no one could immediately explain, as William Carter continued to sit at the center of the table with the calm authority of a man who had never been questioned in a room like this before, while Aaliyah Johnson stood only a few feet away, still holding the menu, still composed, and still saying nothing. The silence that followed his insult was not empty. It was loaded, like the air before a storm that everyone senses but no one knows how to name. Around them, the executives returned to their papers and screens too quickly, as if ignoring the moment would erase it, but Aaliyah noticed everything. She always did. The slight shift in eye contact between the lawyers, the way one investor adjusted his cuff as if uncomfortable, the brief hesitation in William Carter's assistant before pretending nothing unusual had occurred. In that hesitation, she recognized something familiar, not power itself, but the fragility underneath it when it is not questioned often enough. William Carter took a sip of water, already moving on in his mind, already categorizing her into irrelevance again, but Aaliyah did not leave. Instead, she turned slightly toward the table adjacent to his, where a stack of documents lay open beside a tablet displaying contract terms for the evening's acquisition discussion. She had seen those pages earlier, not out of curiosity, but because her job required moving efficiently through tight spaces. And in doing so, she had caught something unusual, a clause buried in legal formatting that referenced liability distribution in a way that did not align with standard regulatory structure. At the time, she had told herself it was not her place to interpret it, but now, standing in the center of that insult, she understood something else entirely, that silence was not always protection. Sometimes it was permission for mistakes to continue unnoticed. William Carter leaned slightly toward one of his partners and made a quiet remark that drew a small, dismissive smile, and that smile confirmed everything Aaliyah needed to know about the room's confidence in itself. It was not just confidence in success, it was confidence in being correct without question. Aaliyah finally moved, not toward him, not away from him, but toward the edge of the table where the document sat. Her steps were calm, measured, almost invisible in sound against the marble floor, but every movement felt intentional, like someone choosing the exact moment to step outside a role they had been assigned. She placed her hand lightly on the edge of the table, not touching the documents yet, but close enough that her presence could not be ignored anymore. William Carter noticed this shift and turned his head slightly, his expression unchanged but his attention now redirected. He did not ask her what she was doing, because in his world, people like her did not initiate actions that mattered. Instead, he assumed it would resolve itself, that she would step back into invisibility once reminded of her place. But Aaliyah did not step back. She looked at the document, then at the contract heading, then at the clause she had seen earlier, and something in her expression changed, not emotionally, but precisely, like a mind aligning scattered details into a single unavoidable conclusion. The room continued its quiet noise, glassware, paper shuffling, faint conversation, but around Aaliyah the world felt narrowed, as if sound itself had learned where to focus. William Carter's voice cut through slightly as he addressed the table, speaking about projections and timelines, confident and practiced, but Aaliyah was no longer listening to tone. She was reading structure. And structure, unlike tone, did not lie. She traced the paragraph again silently, confirming what she already suspected, and when she finally spoke, it was not loud, not dramatic, not emotional. It was simply clear, and that clarity, more than anything, would begin to change the temperature of the entire room. The moment Aaliyah Johnson spoke, it was not volume that changed the room, but precision, as if every word had been weighed before being released into the air, and William Carter, who had already begun to turn his attention back to the discussion at the table, paused without fully realizing why. She did not raise her voice, she did not gesture dramatically. She simply pointed lightly at the printed clause resting beside the contract heading and said in a calm, steady tone that carried farther than expected in the quiet space, that the liability structure outlined in Section 7 did not align with standard compliance frameworks for this type of acquisition under United States corporate law. The sentence itself was simple in structure, but the reaction it produced was not. One of the legal advisors at the table leaned in almost instinctively, eyes narrowing as they followed where she was pointing, while another shifted forward slightly, pulling the document closer as if verifying whether what they just heard had any weight. William Carter did not respond immediately. His expression did not change in an obvious way, but something in his posture tightened, a subtle recalibration that only occurs when control is interrupted in a space that is supposed to be predictable. Aaliyah continued, still not looking at him directly, as though her focus was entirely on the document itself rather than the hierarchy around it. She explained that the clause redistributed liability in a manner that could expose one party to disproportionate regulatory exposure in the event of post-merger audit review, and she referenced it with such familiarity that the surrounding executives began to exchange brief glances. It was not what she said alone, but how she said it, as though she had not just read the document, but understood the framework behind it. One of the investors quietly asked the legal team if that section had been reviewed twice, and for the first time that evening, there was a delay before anyone answered. William Carter finally leaned forward, his voice lower than before, not angry yet, but sharper, asking her how exactly she believed she was qualified to interpret a multi-billion-dollar acquisition agreement while working a service position in a restaurant. The question was not just about knowledge, it was about permission. The room shifted again, attention now fully divided between the table and the waitress who was not supposed to be part of it. Aaliyah did not step back. Instead, she finally looked at him directly, and when she spoke again, she did not challenge his authority. She simply extended the logic of what she had already observed. She stated that she was not interpreting the entire agreement, only identifying a specific inconsistency that any first-year corporate law student would be trained to recognize during contract review exercises. The simplicity of that statement created a different kind of silence, one that was no longer social, but analytical. One of the lawyers reached for the document again, this time with visible urgency, scanning the section she had indicated. The atmosphere at the table began to change in a way that could not be controlled by tone or status. William Carter's assistant leaned in and quietly confirmed that the clause had originated from a third-party legal draft submitted during final negotiation stages, and that it had not been flagged during summary review. That confirmation landed differently than any insult or disagreement could have. It introduced uncertainty. Aaliyah stepped back slightly from the table, returning her hands to a neutral position, not because she had finished speaking, but because she had already said what needed to be understood. William Carter now looked at the document instead of her, his focus shifting from dismissal to verification, and for the first time since the beginning of the evening, the conversation at the table was no longer fully under his direction. The room, once defined by quiet confidence and controlled hierarchy, now held a different kind of tension, one that came not from confrontation, but from the realization that something previously ignored had just become impossible to overlook. The air inside the Manhattan restaurant had changed in a way that was no longer subtle. As William Carter sat slightly forward now, his attention no longer divided between conversation and confidence, but locked entirely onto the document in front of him as if it had transformed into something unfamiliar. Around the table, the legal advisors had stopped pretending this was routine, their eyes moving faster across the printed pages, scanning lines that had previously been accepted without question, while Aaliyah Johnson stood a few feet away, no longer speaking, no longer moving toward the table, simply observing what her words had already set in motion. The silence was not empty anymore. It was active, filled with calculation and reconsideration. One of the senior attorneys finally spoke, carefully choosing each word as he confirmed that the clause she had identified did indeed introduce a liability distribution structure that could potentially shift financial exposure in ways that were not aligned with the original acquisition framework discussed during preliminary negotiations. That confirmation, spoken in a controlled professional tone, carried more weight than any accusation could have, because it did not come from her. It came from within their own system. William Carter did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the document for several seconds longer than necessary, as if expecting it to change or correct itself under scrutiny. The confidence that had filled his posture earlier in the evening was not gone, but it was no longer absolute. He asked quietly for clarification, not from Aaliyah, but from his legal team, requesting confirmation of when exactly this version of the clause had been introduced into the final draft. A brief hesitation followed. One of those moments in corporate environments where silence carries more meaning than speech, and then the answer came, indicating that the language had been included during the final integration phase by an external advisory group. That detail shifted the atmosphere again, because it meant the issue was not theoretical, it was procedural. Aaliyah remained still, her presence no longer seen as interruption but as reference point. She had not raised her voice, she had not forced attention. Yet the entire table was now oriented around what she had noticed. William Carter finally looked back at her directly, his expression more controlled now, less dismissive, more analytical. He asked her where she had learned to recognize such discrepancies in legal documentation, and the question was no longer sarcastic, but measured, as if recalibrating his understanding of the situation. Aaliyah responded calmly, stating that she had previously studied corporate law coursework while attending university in New York before circumstances required her to step away from formal education and enter the workforce. The explanation was simple, without embellishment, but it altered perception in a way that no dramatic revelation could. The executives around the table exchanged quieter glances now, not of amusement, but reassessment. One of them leaned toward the contract again, flipping to earlier pages, searching for consistency across sections that now felt less certain than they had moments before. William Carter leaned back slightly, not in relaxation, but in reflection, his gaze shifting between the document and the woman who had brought attention to it without attempting to gain advantage from it. The restaurant around them continued to operate, servers moving between tables, glasses being refilled, conversations continuing in distant corners. But at this specific table, the hierarchy had become temporarily unstable. What had begun as a moment of insult had transitioned into something far more disruptive, not because of confrontation, but because of accuracy. Aaliyah did not look satisfied or victorious. She simply stood in place, waiting as the implications of what she had pointed out continued to unfold in real time. William Carter finally closed the folder slightly, not shutting the matter down, but acknowledging that it required further internal review. For the first time since the evening began, the direction of control within the room was no longer entirely predictable, and everyone present understood, even without speaking it aloud, that something had just shifted beyond the boundaries of expectation. The moment the legal team confirmed the irregularity a second time, the atmosphere inside the Manhattan restaurant shifted from quiet attention into something far more uncertain. As William Carter remained seated, but noticeably less relaxed than before, his fingers now resting still against the edge of the table instead of moving with habitual confidence. The document that had once been treated as routine now felt heavier in meaning, not because the words had changed, but because they were being seen differently. Around him, the executives no longer spoke in overlapping confidence, but in measured fragments, as if every sentence required verification before being spoken aloud. Aaliyah Johnson stood in the same position she had held since speaking, neither advancing nor retreating, simply present, while the consequences of her observation continued to unfold through professionals trained to trust systems more than people. One of the senior partners finally suggested that the clause required immediate review by external compliance counsel before any further progression of the agreement, and that statement alone was enough to halt the natural flow of the evening's negotiation. William Carter nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the environment had changed from execution to examination. He asked for the full history of the document revisions, and the assistant beside him quickly began searching through the digital records, scrolling with increasing urgency as the implications became clearer with each layer uncovered. Aaliyah remained silent now, her role no longer active in speech, but fully present in consequence. The room no longer saw her as a server interrupting a business conversation, but as the origin point of a problem that required resolution. William Carter finally turned his attention back toward her, studying her not with irritation, but with a recalibrated focus, as if attempting to understand how someone outside his professional world had identified something his own team had overlooked. He asked her directly if she had any formal legal training beyond introductory coursework, and the question carried less skepticism now and more genuine inquiry. Aaliyah answered without hesitation, explaining that she had spent time studying corporate law principles during her university years, with a particular focus on contract structure and liability frameworks, before circumstances forced her to leave school and take on full-time work to support her family. Her explanation was factual, without emotional framing, yet it added a layer of depth that was impossible to ignore. One of the investors leaned back slightly, glancing between her and the document as if reinterpreting the entire interaction from the beginning. The legal counsel at the table continued reviewing the clause, now cross-referencing it with regulatory guidelines, and the longer they examined it, the more apparent it became that her initial observation had not been speculative, but structurally valid. William Carter exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that suggested not defeat, but recognition that something within the process had failed to maintain its expected integrity. He asked for the agreement to be paused from progression until full verification could be completed, and that decision immediately altered the direction of the evening. The energy that once centered around negotiation and control now shifted toward review and correction, and within that shift, the presence of Aaliyah Johnson became something no longer peripheral. She was no longer the person who had delivered a comment. She was the reason the comment now required institutional response. The restaurant continued to function around them, unchanged in its design and service, but within the private space of that table, every assumption that had defined the evening was now under quiet reconstruction, and William Carter, for the first time that night, was not leading the room, but listening to it in a completely different way. The verification process inside the Manhattan restaurant had moved beyond a simple contract review and into a full procedural audit. As William Carter now sat in complete silence, his attention divided between the legal team and the unfolding confirmation that the clause Aaliyah Johnson had identified was not an isolated drafting inconsistency, but part of a broader structural risk embedded within the agreement. The senior legal advisor spoke carefully, explaining that upon deeper inspection, the liability redistribution language could potentially expose Carter Dynamics to disproportionate regulatory responsibility if certain performance thresholds were not met within the first 18 months post-acquisition, a detail that had not been highlighted in the executive summary provided earlier. That statement caused a visible shift in the room, not of panic, but of recalibration, as individuals who had entered the evening expecting a controlled negotiation were now forced into a position of reassessment. William Carter remained composed on the surface, but his stillness was no longer the stillness of confidence. It was the stillness of active calculation. He asked for confirmation from the external advisory group responsible for the final integration draft, and within moments, a second legal consultant on the call confirmed that the clause had been inserted during late-stage consolidation without explicit escalation to senior executive review. The implications of that acknowledgement settled across the table like a weight that no one immediately addressed aloud. Aaliyah Johnson had not moved since her last statement. She stood at a respectful distance from the table, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer interpreted through the lens of service, but through the unexpected accuracy of her observation. William Carter finally turned toward her again, this time without the earlier dismissiveness or challenge, and asked a different kind of question, one that no longer attempted to diminish her role, but to understand its origin. He asked whether her understanding of contract law came from academic study alone or from professional exposure beyond her current position. Aaliyah responded with steady clarity, explaining that she had completed advanced coursework in corporate legal studies during her time at university in New York and had continued self-directed study in contract analysis after leaving formal education due to family obligations that required immediate financial stability. Her tone was not defensive nor performative. It was factual, and that factual nature carried more weight than any attempt at justification. Around the table, the investors and legal representatives had now fully shifted their attention away from assumption and toward verification. As pages were revisited, clauses were rechecked, and prior confidence in the document's integrity was no longer assumed but tested. One of the senior partners quietly acknowledged that the clause in question would require formal renegotiation language if it were to remain in the agreement, effectively confirming that the deal could not proceed under its current structure without significant revision. William Carter absorbed that information without interruption, his gaze moving briefly from the document to Aaliyah and back again, as if attempting to reconcile two parallel realities that had collided in real time. The restaurant around them continued its evening service, untouched by the disruption occurring within the private negotiation space. Yet within that space, every previous assumption about control, expertise, and visibility had been destabilized. Aaliyah remained still, not seeking acknowledgement or validation, simply existing at the center of an outcome she had not demanded but had made unavoidable through precision alone. William Carter finally closed the folder in front of him, not as an act of dismissal, but as a signal that the current state of discussion had reached an irreversible pause. And in that pause, the dynamic of the room had permanently shifted into something no longer defined by hierarchy alone, but by the undeniable presence of overlooked insight now fully exposed. The pause that followed the closing of the contract folder did not feel like an ending, but rather like a suspension of everything the room had previously assumed to be stable. as William Carter remained seated in silence with his gaze lowered toward the table, no longer projecting authority in the way he had earlier that evening, but instead processing the implications of what had just been uncovered. The legal team around him continued their quiet verification, confirming details in restrained tones that carried across the table in measured fragments, each one reinforcing the same conclusion that the clause Aaliyah Johnson had identified was not only valid in concern, but significant enough to require structural revision before any forward movement could occur. Aaliyah herself remained still, positioned slightly away from the table, no longer speaking, no longer intervening, simply present in a way that now felt fundamentally different to everyone in the room. The executives who had entered the evening with confidence in their expectations were now observing the situation through a lens of reassessment, where every earlier assumption about control, hierarchy, and awareness was being silently reorganized. William Carter finally leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling in a controlled manner that suggested not frustration, but recognition that the environment he had carefully constructed for negotiation had shifted in ways that could not be easily reversed or ignored. After a few moments, he spoke again, not to dismiss the issue, but to acknowledge its seriousness, instructing his legal team to suspend all finalization steps pending a comprehensive external review, a decision that immediately reframed the trajectory of the entire agreement. The room did not react dramatically, but the weight of that instruction was understood by everyone present, because it meant the process had moved from execution into uncertainty. William Carter then turned his attention fully toward Aaliyah Johnson, and this time his expression carried none of the earlier dismissiveness or controlled amusement, but something closer to measured curiosity mixed with reluctant acknowledgement. He asked her directly how long she had been able to identify structural inconsistencies in legal frameworks with that level of precision, and the question was no longer positioned as a challenge, but as an attempt to understand capability that had not been accounted for. Aaliyah responded calmly, explaining that her understanding had developed through a combination of formal education in corporate law studies and sustained independent learning after leaving university due to family responsibilities that required immediate financial stability, and she stated it without embellishment, without seeking validation, presenting it simply as fact. The executives at the table remained quiet as she spoke, some glancing between her and the documents again, as if reinterpreting the earlier moments through this new context. One of the senior legal advisors admitted that her initial observation had likely prevented a significant contractual exposure that might not have been detected until post-execution review, a statement that subtly shifted the perception of her role in the evening from incidental presence to functional impact. William Carter nodded slowly, absorbing that confirmation, and for a moment the room returned to silence, not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of recalibration. He then did something unexpected within the structure of the evening. He asked her if she would be willing to review the remainder of the document with the legal team before any revised version was finalized, not as a courtesy, but as a practical request grounded in what had already been demonstrated. Aaliyah did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but as if evaluating whether the request was consistent with her boundaries and position. After a brief moment, she agreed, not with hesitation, but with clarity, stepping slightly closer to the table as the legal team adjusted their materials to include her input. The shift in the room was no longer about surprise, but about integration, as someone previously positioned outside the structure of decision-making was now being included within it based on demonstrated insight. William Carter observed this transition quietly, no longer attempting to assert dominance over the situation, but instead allowing the process to continue in a revised form that accounted for what had been revealed. The restaurant continued its evening service around them, indifferent to the significance of what had occurred at one table, yet within that space, the balance of perception had been permanently altered. Aaliyah Johnson remained focused on the documents in front of her, contributing only when necessary, while the legal team adapted to her input with increasing acknowledgement of accuracy. William Carter, for the first time that night, did not occupy the center of control in the conversation, but instead participated within it, and in that subtle shift, the entire structure of authority that had defined the evening was no longer intact in the same way it had been at the beginning. The transition from verification to collaboration inside the Manhattan restaurant was no longer tentative, but increasingly structured, as Aaliyah Johnson remained positioned beside the legal team reviewing the contract with a level of focus that shifted the dynamic of the entire table from observation to participation. William Carter had not spoken for several minutes, not because he had withdrawn, but because he was observing how the process itself was changing under the weight of corrected information. The executives who had once filled the space with confident negotiation had now adjusted into a quieter rhythm, allowing space for analysis rather than assumption. Aaliyah continued to move through sections of the document with precision, identifying structural inconsistencies, confirming alignment with regulatory standards, and pointing out areas where language ambiguity could lead to unintended financial exposure. Each time she spoke, the legal team responded not with resistance, but with verification, cross-checking her observations against internal models that increasingly confirmed her accuracy. William Carter finally leaned forward again, this time addressing the room in a controlled tone that acknowledged the revised state of the discussion. He instructed that all prior assumptions regarding the agreement structure be set aside, and that the document be reconstructed under full compliance oversight before any further negotiation steps were considered. That instruction effectively redefined the evening, transforming what had been a finalization meeting into a full reevaluation process. Aaliyah did not react to the shift in authority being redistributed around her. She simply continued her review, moving line by line through sections of the agreement with consistent attention. One of the senior legal advisors quietly remarked that her ability to identify inconsistencies without access to internal drafting history suggested not only academic familiarity, but applied analytical understanding that was rare even among experienced professionals. William Carter heard the comment and did not challenge it. Instead, he watched as Aaliyah marked another section of the document for revision, her focus unbroken by the attention now surrounding her. The atmosphere in the room had changed from hierarchical certainty to procedural awareness, where every participant was now dependent on accuracy rather than position. After several minutes, William Carter asked a final question, not directed at the legal team, but at Aaliyah herself. He asked whether she would consider continuing her involvement in the review process beyond this evening, not as a temporary observer, but as a contributing consultant during the restructuring phase. The question carried weight not because of its tone, but because of its implication that her role was no longer confined to the moment of discovery. Aaliyah paused briefly, not in hesitation, but in evaluation, and then responded that she would be willing to assist within reasonable scope, provided that her input remained focused on analysis rather than authority. That response further clarified her position in the room, not as someone seeking elevation, but as someone committed to precision. William Carter nodded once, acknowledging the condition without resistance. The legal team adjusted accordingly, integrating her observations into their working revisions as the document shifted from final draft to active correction. Around them, the restaurant continued its evening flow, unaware of the structural recalibration occurring within one private space. Yet within that space, the hierarchy that had defined the beginning of the night had been fundamentally restructured. William Carter now observed the process rather than directing it, and Aaliyah Johnson continued to contribute within it, not as an outsider challenging authority, but as a presence that had quietly redefined what authority required in order to remain valid. The final stage of the evening inside the Manhattan restaurant no longer resembled a negotiation in the traditional sense, but rather a structured reconstruction of every assumption that had led to the current version of the agreement. As William Carter remained seated at the head of the table with a controlled silence that reflected not authority asserted, but authority recalibrated. The legal team continued working through revised sections of the document with increased precision, now incorporating Aaliyah Johnson's observations as verified input rather than external commentary. In each adjustment, they made reinforced the realization that the initial draft had contained structural weaknesses that had gone unnoticed until this moment. Aaliyah stood slightly to the side of the table, her role now clearly defined within the process as analytical contributor, moving only when necessary to clarify a section or confirm interpretation, her presence steady and unaffected by the attention that had once dismissed her entirely. William Carter finally spoke after a long pause, addressing the table in a measured tone that acknowledged the shift in direction. He confirmed that the agreement would not proceed in its current form, and that all final execution steps would be suspended until a complete structural review and revalidation process had been completed under independent compliance oversight. The statement was not dramatic, but its impact was immediate, as it formally redefined the outcome of the evening from conclusion to correction. Around the table, executives responded with quiet acknowledgement rather than resistance, understanding that the revised course was now procedural necessity rather than optional adjustment. William Carter then turned his attention toward Aaliyah directly, and for the first time since the beginning of the evening, his expression carried neither challenge nor calculation, but recognition of capability that had not been previously accounted for in his assessment of the environment. He stated that her input had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the agreement review, and that her analysis had prevented potential exposure that would have only been identified under post-execution audit conditions. Aaliyah responded without emphasis, reiterating that her contribution was based solely on observation and structural understanding rather than intent to influence outcome beyond accuracy. The exchange remained professional, but it marked a clear transformation in how she was positioned within the space, no longer as service staff adjacent to a conversation, but as an integrated participant within a technical process. The legal team continued refining sections of the agreement, now referencing her identified clauses as validated checkpoints, while external counsel prepared documentation for formal restructuring. William Carter observed this progression in silence for several moments, then asked a final procedural question regarding whether she would be available for continued consultation during the next phase of review. Aaliyah agreed under the same condition she had previously stated, that her role remained focused strictly on analytical input. The agreement was accepted without hesitation, further solidifying her defined position within the process. As the revisions continued, the atmosphere within the restaurant gradually returned to its normal rhythm externally. Yet within the private space of the table, the structure of decision-making had permanently shifted. William Carter no longer operated as the sole directional force in the conversation, but as part of a collaborative reassessment environment shaped by corrected information. Aaliyah Johnson remained composed, her attention on the documents in front of her, contributing only when necessary, while the legal team adjusted to a standard of verification that had been elevated beyond its initial expectations. By the time the final adjustments of the evening were summarized for temporary closure, the agreement that had once been considered near completion had transformed into a fully restructured framework requiring renewed validation. William Carter closed the folder in front of him with deliberate control, not as an act of finality, but as acknowledgement that the process had fundamentally changed. In that moment, the evening reached its true resolution, not through conclusion of the deal, but through the recognition that authority within the room had been redistributed by evidence, precision, and the presence of insight that had previously gone unseen, leaving a permanent shift in how every participant understood value, competence, and contribution moving forward.